World History, Chapter 26, Section 4, Making Peace. And one of the things to kind of focus on is, does might make right? So just because you're on the winning side of things, does that justify your actions or decisions? By the end of the chapter, assess the cost of World War I, the issues that the delegates of the Paris Peace Conference faced and had to deal with, and then what was the deal with all the dissatisfaction people had with the Treaty of Versailles, as well as the other peace settlements that took place during this time. So if we look at the cost of war, one of the things that the book briefly mentions, and we'll look a little bit more at this in the U.S. history, is a couple of things are happening. 1918 and 1919, flu pandemic goes across the world. So the World War I plays a factor in this because it more than likely starts in the United States, and it starts right as American soldiers are kind of heading overseas, and so they're taking this flu with them, and so it ravages the battlefields, and then it circulates around the globe, and then it mutates a little bit, and it comes back in another wave in 1919, and this is a particularly deadly form of the flu. So like I said, we'll talk about it more in U.S. history, but that's how this factors in. And so not only are people dealing with the cost of World War I, but then they're dealing with the cost of this flu pandemic that in some places killed nearly a quarter of the population. So it's pretty tough sledding to kind of go through. When we look at the financial toll, again, this is a total war. It takes all of a country's resources, and they pile up a ton of debt. And so when you look at having to rebuild Europe, it's tough. As a matter of fact, Great Britain on March 9th, 2015, finally repaid all of their World War I debt. So that isn't paying off World War II debt yet. And if you look at Germany on October 3rd, 2010, they finally paid back the final reparations payments from World War I. So that's how long it took, nearly 100 years to pay off all of this that they kind of built up over time. And that doesn't deal even with the casualties and the deaths and all those other things. The other problem is Europe is more of a mess than it was probably before World War I. That may be a bit of a stretch, but when you look at the map of Europe, you see on the left-hand side Europe before World War I, and then you see Europe post World War I, and there's a whole bunch of brand new countries. If you look at Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman empires are just devastated, and that they no longer exist in their previous form. Russia is going to reemerge here more quickly than the other two. The other two never reemerge. It also is a time where radicals and conservatives are fighting over control of governments. Do we want to really dramatically change the way we do things, or do we want to kind of roll back and try and make things like it was before World War I? And on top of this, you've got colonial soldiers who are returning back home who are pretty doubtful of the ability of Europeans to settle anything peacefully. And so when they return back home, whether it be to India or Africa or wherever, they are going to renew the call for their own independence and to drive these colonial powers out of their country. When we look at the Paris Peace Conference itself, the real problem here is the three leaders, the big three, Clemenceau from France, Wilson from the United States, and David Lloyd George from Great Britain, have very different goals in mind. Wilson probably has the most pure goals, as he really wants to try and create a peace that's going to last for all time. But that's pretty tough to do, and he gets a little preachy, and Clemenceau isn't a huge fan of Wilson. Clemenceau, on the other hand, has a pretty clear goal. He wants to punish Germany for what happened, and he wants to make sure that Germany can never invade France again. And for David Lloyd George, he wants to kind of balance things between France and Germany, and he really wants to protect the British Empire. So those are three very different goals going into this thing. Other problems with this peace conference is that these three countries and these three leaders are really going to determine the fate of the world in a lot of ways. The Russian question, they have no idea what to do with Russia. They're trying to influence the outcome of the Russian Revolution, and then once this Russian Revolution ends, they really don't know what the heck to do with it. So that's causing problems. It's a treaty of exclusion. They keep the Germans out. They're not allowed to be part of the peacemaking process. They keep the press out. It really is these three guys with a handful of other players in the room, but these three are dominating things. Italy is ticked off because they were promised land, and it doesn't seem like they're going to give it. Self-determination looks like it's going to sweep across the world, but really when they say self-determination, they just mean for the people in Europe, not for the people around the world. And when you look at Wilson's 14 points, little by little, bit by bit, Clemenceau and David Lloyd George just chip away at that thing so that the only thing that's left is really one key point, and we'll talk about that in a moment here. The other problem when we look at this, the war guilt clause. They basically made Germany solely responsible. So in the peace agreement, they put in there that it was Germans' fault for the war, and that they really need to pay back all of the money that other countries had lost because of this war, and that's what these reparations are. And so this diktat for the German people, they see this as a forced peace agreement, that they didn't have any say in it, they had nothing to do with it, and that they had their arms twisted behind their backs and forced to sign it, and there's going to be a lot of resentment in Germany about this. And that $30 billion of reparations is just totally unrealistic, because the German people lost a tremendous amount of resources, tremendous amount of money, just like everybody else did, and they need to rebuild afterwards. And when you look at the German territorial losses, they lose some of the key places to help them rebuild their industries and rebuild their businesses and their factories and get back up on their feet. So the land that's taken from them is mineral rich, lots of German people in there, and they end up going to other places, and it impacts Germany's ability to pick themselves back up after the war. The other issue is the self-determination in Eastern Europe. Again, other parts of the world are hopeful that that's what's going to happen, and that just simply doesn't. What these people do, these handful of individuals, decide that they're going to create these countries, these mandates, these republics around the world, not really knowing very much about the places that they're dealing with. So for example, if you look at the Middle East, a lot of the problems currently in the Middle East that have existed the last 40, 50, 60 years to present are in part because these individuals thought they knew what they were doing and they really didn't, and they drew countries and threw groups of people together without much thought or understanding. And that's been a problem, and we're paying the price for that ignorance to this day. When we look at the mandate system, Germany's colonies all go to Great Britain and France. So they're able to pick up these key colonies around the world, and they're able to make their colonial empires richer at the same time. So the one piece of the puzzle that's left is the League of Nations. Its duty is to negotiate disputes. And the other thing that they're going to do is if there's aggressors around the world, they're going to take common action and they're going to stamp down those aggressors. The problem is the League of Nations is created by Wilson. It's Wilson's baby. It's Wilson's idea. When it gets to the U.S. Senate, this peace agreement and ratifying the League of Nations, the U.S. Senate doesn't want to do it because they believe it violates the U.S. Constitution. Only Congress can declare war. And by signing off on this, what they're essentially doing is they're giving up their ability to declare war because now the United States would be drugged into wars based on the League of Nations, not on a vote in Congress. So this doesn't get through the U.S. Senate. It probably could have gone through in some kind of a modified form. And again, we'll talk more specifics about that next year in U.S. history.